August 4th, 1961, 10:17 p.m. The August heat in Harlem was biblical, the kind of heat that made asphalt soft and turned fire escapes into ovens. Inside the Lennox Lounge on 125th Street and Lennox Avenue, 3 industrial fans fought a war they couldn't win, pushing humid air in circles while 200 people packed the main room, drinking, laughing, living. The house band, a quartet led by a pianist named Chester, who'd played with Dizzy Gillespie back in '47, laid down a version of Round Midnight so smooth it made the heat almost bearable. The bar ran the entire length of the north wall, zebra-striped Art Deco that had been installed in 1939 and never changed. Behind it, a bartender named Roosevelt, everyone called him Rosie, poured bourbon and scotch with the efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 23 years. His eyes, though, weren't on the drinks. They tracked the front entrance with the vigilance of a soldier expecting artillery. Word had spread 2 hours earlier. The meeting was happening tonight. At a curved booth in the back corner, separated from the crowd by a velvet rope in the presence of 2 men who stood with their backs to the wall, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He wore a midnight blue suit with thin chalk stripes, a white shirt with gold cufflinks, and a silk tie the color of dried blood. His signature fedora sat on the table beside a rocks plaques containing 2 fingers of Hennessy, ice melting slowly in the heat. Bumpy was 54 years old. The prominent bump on the back of his skull, legacy of a childhood fight in Charleston, South Carolina, had given him his nickname 4 decades ago, but the name had taken on new meaning over the years. Bumpy, as in a rough ride, as in unexpected, as in dangerous to underestimate.
His face was a roadmap of Harlem's criminal evolution, the scar above his left eye from the Schultz Wars in the 30s, the slight crook in his nose from an arrest that got physical in '42, the lines around his mouth that came from 3 decades of calculated smiles and strategic silences. But his eyes were what people remembered. They held an intelligence that made prosecutors nervous and rivals paranoid. To his left sat Clarence Porkchop Davis, 300 pounds of loyalty wrapped in a cream-colored suit. Porkchop had been with Bumpy since 1949, had taken a bullet for him in '53, and would take another tomorrow if required. His hands, massive and scarred, rested on the table like sleeping weapons. To Bumpy's right sat Illinois Gordon, thin as a rail and twice as sharp. Illinois ran the numbers for Bumpy's entire operation, every policy bank, every collection point, every payment schedule. He kept a small black ledger in his inside pocket, and that ledger contained information that could destroy or enrich 100 people. Illinois never forgot a number, never missed a discrepancy, never let emotion cloud mathematics. Across from them, the 4th seat at the booth remained empty, waiting. The Lennox Lounge had been Bumpy's unofficial headquarters since 1958. Before that, it had been various other spots, the Red Rooster, Wells Supper Club, Small's Paradise, but the Lennox had the right combination of visibility and privacy, culture and intimidation. The owner, a man named Coleman, who'd bought the place in '57, understood the arrangement. Bumpy's presence brought protection and prestige. In exchange, Bumpy got his corner booth and a 15% stake in the profits. At 10:23 p.m., the front door opened. The conversation didn't stop. That would have been too obvious, but the quality of sound shifted. Voices dropped half an octave. Laughter came a second slower.
The band kept playing, but Chester, the pianist's shoulders tensed, his fingers moving mechanically, while his attention split between keys and door. 3 men entered. The one in front was Anthony Tony Knuckles Marconi, a capo in the Colombo crime family. He was 42, built like a fire hydrant, with slicked back hair the color of motor oil, and a nose that had been broken so many times it looked like abstract art. He wore an expensive suit, Italian cut, probably cost 6 months of a working man's salary, but wore it like armor, not fashion. Behind him came 2 associates. The first was younger, maybe 28, with a thin mustache and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging threats, calculating angles. The second was older, 50-something, with gray temples and the kind of stillness that comes from having killed enough people that it no longer produces adrenaline. Tony Knuckles surveyed the Lennox Lounge like a general surveying territory he intended to annex. His gaze swept across the black faces, the Art Deco bar, the zebra stripes, the photographs of jazz legends on the walls. His expression showed exactly what he thought. This was quaint, cute, temporary. Rosie appeared in front of them, his bartender's smile fixed in place. "Evening, gentlemen. Help you with something?" Tony didn't look at him. "We're here for Johnson." "Mr. Johnson is in his booth," Rosie said, gesturing toward the back. "I'll take you." "We'll find it," Tony cut him off. The walk across the Lennox Lounge took maybe 40 seconds. 40 seconds in which every person in the room tracked the three Italians, marked their movements, noted the bulges under their jackets, calculated what it would mean if this meeting went wrong. A woman in a red dress at the bar set her martini down carefully. Two men playing piano stopped mid-game. Even the piano player, Chester, transitioned to a slower tempo, something minor key and ominous. Bumpy didn't stand when they arrived.
He simply gestured to the empty booth across from him, a minimal movement that somehow commanded absolute attention. "Mr. Marconi," Bumpy said, his voice low and textured like aged whiskey. "Punctual. I appreciate that." Tony slid into the booth, his two associates flanking him. Up close, you could see the details that marked them as outsiders, the gold chains visible at their collars, the pinky rings that caught the light, the cologne that smelled expensive and European and completely out of place among the cigarette smoke and bourbon and sweat of Harlem. "Johnson," Tony said, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement of identity. Bumpy lifted his Hennessy, took a slow sip, set it down. "You said on the phone you had a proposal. I'm listening." Tony leaned back, spreading his arms across the top of the booth, claiming space in that territorial way certain men do when they want to establish dominance. "Let me paint you a picture. The 5 families control most of New York: Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, parts of Manhattan. We got the unions, the docks, the construction, the waste management. We got legitimate businesses and street-level operations. We got a machine that's been running smooth for 30 years. Congratulations," Bumpy said neutrally. "Point is," Tony continued, "we're expanding, consolidating, making the operation more efficient. And Harlem's been operating independently for too long. It's time to bring it into the structure." "The structure," Bumpy repeated, tasting the word. "Our structure," Tony clarified. "We're prepared to offer you a position in it. You'd continue to run day-to-day operations, the numbers, the protection, the distribution, but you'd report to us. We'd take 60%, you'd keep 40%. In exchange, you'd get access to our supply chains, our legal protection, our political connections." Illinois Gordon, the thin accountant, made a soft sound somewhere between a cough and a laugh. Tony's eyes snapped to it.
"Something to say?" 40% of what we currently control at 100%, Illinois said, his voice quiet and precise. "And that's before operating expenses, which I assume we'd still be covering. So realistically, we'd be looking at approximately 25 to 30% net. You're offering us a 70% pay cut and calling it a promotion." Tony's jaw tightened. "You're not factoring in growth potential." "Growth into what?" Illinois asked. "We already control Harlem's underground economy. You're not offering expansion. You're offering absorption." "Watch your tone," the younger associate said, leaning forward. Porkchop Davis shifted slightly in his seat. It was a small movement, but Tony's associates both noticed, both tensed. 300 pounds of muscle doesn't move without people paying attention. Bumpy held up one hand, a gesture that instantly calmed his side of the table. "Let's keep this civil. Mr. Marconi came all the way uptown to make his pitch. Least we can do is hear him out." Tony nodded, appreciating the courtesy even as he recalibrated. "Look, Johnson, I'll be straight with you. The families are moving into Harlem with or without your cooperation. Question is whether you're smart enough to come along or stubborn enough to get steamrolled." "Steamrolled," Bumpy repeated, again just tasting the word, considering its weight. "That's not a threat," Tony said. "It's a forecast. We got resources you can't match. We got judges, cops, politicians, people who owe us, people who fear us. We can make your life very difficult, or we can make it very profitable. Your choice." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. He lifted his glass again, studied the amber liquid, watched the light refract through it. Around them, the Lennox Lounge continued its rhythm, the band playing, conversations humming, life happening. But at this booth, time seemed suspended, waiting for whatever came next. "Tell me something," Bumpy finally said. "This offer, this 60-40 split, this structure you're talking about,
You make the same offer in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx? Tony's expression shifted slightly. Those are different situations. How? Those territories we already control. We're talking about maintaining existing relationships. And what percentage do your people in Brooklyn keep? Bumpy asked. Tony's silence was answer enough. Thought so, Bumpy said. See, what you're really offering isn't partnership. It's surrender with a salary. You're coming up here expecting me to hand over 3 decades of work, relationships, infrastructure, because you got judges in your pocket and cops on your payroll. You say that like it's nothing, Tony said. Legal protection is worth more than street muscle. Maybe, Bumpy acknowledged, but respect is worth more than both, and nothing about your offer shows respect, not to me, not to Harlem, not to the community that built what you're trying to buy. The temperature at the booth dropped. Tony's easy confidence faltered, replaced by something harder, colder. You're making a mistake, Tony said, his voice losing its negotiating tone, becoming something more threatening. You think because you run Harlem you're untouchable? You think because you got history up here that means something to us? It should, Bumpy said calmly. History means infrastructure. It means loyalty. It means knowing every block, every building, every person who matters. You can't buy that. You can't threaten that into existence. We can take it, the older associate said, speaking for the first time. His voice was gravelly, worn down by decades of cigarettes and violence. Piece by piece, if we have to. Bumpy looked at him directly. You're welcome to try. The words hung in the air, polite but absolute. Tony leaned forward now, abandoning any pretense of negotiation, moving into pure intimidation. Let me explain something to you, Johnson.
We're not some street gang you can outthink or outmaneuver. We're an organization. We got structures that go back to Sicily, traditions that have survived wars and prosecutions, and every attempt to destroy us. When we decide something happens, it happens. When we decide someone's done, they're done. Impressive, Bumpy said, but you're still just men. Men who bleed, men who make mistakes, men who can be beaten. I've been hearing about how untouchable various people were my whole life. Most of them are dead now.
Tony's face flushed. You threatening us? No, Bumpy said simply. Just observing. The younger associate started to stand, but Tony put a hand on his arm, holding him back. This was the critical moment, the place where words either diffused into continued negotiation or exploded into something irreversible. You're making this personal, Tony said, his voice tight with controlled anger. It's not personal. It's business. Everything is personal, Bumpy countered. Business is personal. Territory is personal. Respect is personal. You came up here thinking you could separate those things, but you can't. Not in Harlem. Tony stood abruptly, his associates following. He looked down at Bumpy with undisguised contempt, the mask finally dropping completely. You know what your problem is, Johnson, Tony said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you're special. You think because you run this little neighborhood, because you got some history, because people up here respect you, that makes you something. But you're not. You're just another. He paused, searching for the right word, the word that would cut deepest, that would establish once and for all the hierarchy he believed in. You're just another nigger with delusions of grandeur. The word detonated like dynamite in a closed room. The piano stopped. Chester's fingers froze above the keys mid-phrase, the sudden silence more deafening than any sound. Every conversation in the Lennox Lounge died instantly. Rosie, behind the bar, dropped the bottle he'd been pouring from. It shattered on the floor, the crash echoing through the frozen space. 200 people stopped breathing simultaneously. Porkchop Davis's hands moved from ready to ready in a microsecond. Illinois Gordon removed his glasses slowly, folding them with deliberate care and placing them in his pocket, the gesture he made when violence was no longer theoretical. At the bar, 3 men stood from their stools.
Near the stage, 2 more shifted positions. The exits, which had been open, suddenly had people standing near them. But Bumpy didn't move. He sat there, perfectly still, his Hennessy glass on the table, his hands relaxed, his expression unchanged. If the slur had landed like a physical blow, if rage was calculating murder behind his eyes, if violence was coiling in his muscles ready to spring. None of it showed. He simply looked at Tony Maronei with those ancient, knowing eyes. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds of absolute quiet, in which the only sound was the ceiling fans continuing their futile rotation and the distant sound of a car passing on Lennox Avenue outside. Tony's associates both smiled. They thought they'd won. The Italian in the expensive suit had used the forbidden word, had put the black man in his place, had reminded everyone of the natural order of things. One of them even chuckled, a low, mean sound, full of satisfaction. Tony himself straightened his jacket, preparing to leave, preparing to walk out of the Lennox Lounge, having established dominance, having put Bumpy Johnson and all of Harlem on notice that the Colombo family could say whatever they wanted, do whatever they wanted, take whatever they wanted. Then Bumpy spoke. His voice was the same low, textured tone he'd maintained throughout the entire conversation. No anger, no volume, just absolute, unshakable certainty. You just made the last mistake you'll ever make in Harlem. Tony's smile faltered. That a threat? No, Bumpy said. It's a notification. Of what? Bumpy's fingers drummed once on the table. A small gesture, barely visible. But around the room, people saw it. People who'd been waiting for exactly that signal. You came up here thinking you could take Harlem, Bumpy said, his voice still quiet, still measured. You came with your offers and your threats and your 60-40 split.
You came thinking we'd be grateful or scared or smart enough to surrender. But what you actually did was show me exactly who you are. And who's that? Tony asked, mockery in his tone despite the unease creeping into his expression. A man who doesn't respect what he can't understand, Bumpy said. A man who thinks power is just muscle and money. A man who uses that word and expects it to make him bigger instead of smaller. Tony glanced around for the first time, actually seeing the room. Every face was turned toward them. Every eye was locked on his position. And none of them, not one single person in the entire Lennox Lounge, looked friendly or scared or intimidated. They looked unified. You threatening me in front of witnesses, Tony said, trying to reclaim control of the situation. These aren't witnesses, Bumpy said. These are neighbors, family, community. This is Harlem, Mr. Maronei. Every person in this room heard what you called me. Every person in this room understands what that means. Every person in this room is going to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. So what? Tony's voice had lost its certainty. So this, Bumpy said. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance across the table, and spoke 6 words that would echo through Harlem's streets for decades to come. 6 words that would be repeated in barbershops and churches, in policy joints and late-night diners, in family gatherings and street corner conversations. 6 words that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Italian crime families and the black neighborhoods they tried to control. You'll never be safe here again. The words landed with surgical precision. Tony opened his mouth, closed it. His brain was processing the implications, running calculations, measuring threats against capabilities.
Around him, his associates had finally noticed what he'd been too arrogant to see, that every exit was covered, that men had materialized from the shadows, that the Lennox Lounge wasn't a nightclub anymore. It was a trap. You can't touch us, Tony said, but his voice had lost all conviction. We're made men. You kill us, the entire Colombo family comes down on Harlem like... We're not going to kill you, Bumpy interrupted. We're going to let you leave. You and your 2 friends are going to walk out that door, get in your car, and drive back to Brooklyn. You're going to tell your bosses exactly what happened here. You're going to tell them the offer was rejected. And you're going to tell them why. Why? Tony whispered, though he already knew. Because you used that word, Bumpy said simply. Because you came into our neighborhood, sat in our booth, and showed us that no matter what deal you offered, no matter what partnership you proposed, you'd never see us as equals. You'd never respect us. You'd never honor any agreement. Because at the end of the day, to you, we're just niggers with delusions of grandeur. Tony flinched at hearing the word repeated back to him. So here's what's going to happen, Bumpy continued, his voice never rising, never-changing tempo. You're going to leave. But you'll never be safe here again. Not you, not your associates, not anyone the Colombo family sends. You can walk these streets. We're not going to stop you. But you'll never know which corner, which doorway, which shadow holds someone who remembers tonight. You'll never know which bartender is pouring you a drink with hands that remember what you called me. You'll never know which taxi driver is taking you through Harlem with thoughts of what you said. That's paranoia, Tony said. But he was already backing toward the aisle. No, Bumpy corrected. That's consequences. You wanted to come to Harlem? Fine. But now, Harlem knows you.
Knows your face, knows your voice, knows exactly what you think of us. And that knowledge, that memory, will follow you every second you're north of 96th Street. Tony's associates were already moving toward the door. The older one kept his hand inside his jacket where his weapon lived, but he wasn't stupid enough to draw it. Not here, not now. Not with 20 armed men watching him from various positions around the room. "This isn't over," Tony said, retreating but trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "Yes," Bumpy said quietly. "It is. You just don't realize it yet." Tony turned to leave, but Bumpy's voice stopped him one more time. "Mr. Marconi." Tony looked back. "When you tell your bosses what happened tonight, make sure you tell them everything. Don't leave out the part where you used that word. Don't leave out the part where you assumed we'd be too scared or too stupid to refuse. Don't leave out the part where you walked into Harlem thinking it was just another neighborhood to conquer, and walked out realizing it's a fortress." Tony said nothing. There was nothing to say. He and his associates moved toward the door. Not running, pride wouldn't allow that, but moving with purpose. Moving with the understanding that every second they stayed was a second they might not be allowed to leave. The crowd parted for them in silence. No one jeered, no one threatened. They simply watched, bearing witness to a historical moment. The moment when the Italian crime families learned that Harlem wasn't for sale, wasn't for taking, wasn't territory to be absorbed into their structures and systems. The door closed behind them. Outside, a car engine started, probably a Cadillac, probably black, probably driven by a fourth associate who'd been waiting.
Tires squealed slightly as they pulled away from the curb too fast, headed south on Lennox Avenue, headed back to Brooklyn, headed back to report a failure that would ripple through the Colombo family's calculations for years to come. Only when the sound of the engine faded completely did the Lennox Lounge exhale. Chester, the pianist's fingers would turn to the keys, picking up a new song, something up-tempo and defiant, something that felt like celebration even though the melody was minor. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, charged with electricity, with the understanding that something significant had just happened. Rosie poured drinks with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The men who'd been standing near exits returned to their seats, relaxed but vigilant. At the curved booth in the back corner, Bumpy Johnson sat perfectly still, his Hennessy finally finished, his expression distant. Porkchop Davis leaned in, his massive frame blocking sightlines from the rest of the room. "They'll retaliate." "No," Bumpy said. "They won't." "You sure about that?" Illinois Gordon asked, replacing his glasses. "The Colombo family doesn't forgive insults." "It wasn't an insult," Bumpy explained. "It was a lesson. Tony's going to go back and tell his bosses what happened. He'll probably edit the story, make himself look better, but the core truth will be there. They offered a deal. We rejected it. Things got heated, and they left with their tails between their legs." And when his bosses ask why things got heated, Porkchop asked. "He'll have to tell them," Bumpy said. "He'll have to admit he used that word, and the moment he does, they'll understand why the deal fell apart. Because you can't build a partnership on disrespect. You can't maintain a business relationship when one side fundamentally doesn't believe the other side deserves equality." Illinois made a note in his small black ledger.
What about the threat? You'll never be safe here again. That's going to force a response. It wasn't a threat to kill him, Bumpy corrected. It was a statement of reality. Every person in this room tonight heard what he called me. Every person in this room will tell 10 other people. By tomorrow morning,
Every black person in Harlem will know that Tony Maronei walked into the Lennox Lounge and called Bumpy Johnson a nigger. You think any of those people are going to smile and serve him dinner if he comes back? You think any of those people are going to forget? Social pressure, Illinois murmured, understanding. Exactly, Bumpy confirmed. The Colombo family could send soldiers, could start a war, could try to muscle their way into Harlem, but it would cost them millions in money and manpower. It would draw federal attention, and at the end of it all, they'd still be operating in a neighborhood where every face they see remembers what was said tonight. That's not sustainable. That's not good business. Porkchop grinned slowly. So we won without firing a shot. We won by making them understand the cost, Bumpy said. War isn't about who can kill the most people. It's about who can make the other side realize that winning isn't worth the price. Tonight, we showed the Colombo family exactly what the price would be. A waitress approached, a woman named Dorothy who'd been working at the Lennox since it opened, and set a fresh Hennessy in front of Bumpy. She didn't say anything, just gave him a look of profound respect and gratitude before moving away. Why those 6 words? Illinois asked. You'll never be safe here again. Why not something more direct? Bumpy considered the question. Because safety is more valuable than life. You can live in constant danger. Soldiers do it. Criminals do it. But you can't operate in constant insecurity. Tony Maronei needs to feel like he controls his environment to do his job.
I just told him he'll never have that feeling in Harlem again. That's more debilitating than any bullet. Psychological warfare, Porkchop said approvingly. The only kind that matters, Bumpy agreed. Physical violence is temporary. You shoot someone, they heal or they die, and either way it's over. But psychological pressure, that lasts, that compounds, that changes behavior over time. The 3 men sat in silence for a moment, processing the evening's events. Around them, the Lennox Lounge had returned to its normal rhythm, but there was an undercurrent now, an energy that came from collective experience, from shared witnessing of something significant. What do we do now? Illinois asked. Now? Bumpy lifted his fresh Hennessy, studied it in the light. Now we wait. We let the story spread. We let Tony and his bosses do the math. We let them realize that Harlem isn't worth the cost. And we keep doing what we've always done, protecting our neighborhood, serving our community, building something that belongs to us. And if they don't get the message, Porkchop pressed. If they send someone else? Bumpy's expression hardened slightly. Then that someone learns the same lesson the hard way. But they won't. Organized crime is business, not emotion. The Colombo family will sit down, look at the numbers, and realize that forcing their way into Harlem would cost more than any potential profit. They'll respect the boundary. Not because they respect us, but because they respect their own bottom line. You're betting everything on them being rational, Illinois observed. I'm betting on them being criminals, Bumpy corrected. Criminals are the most rational people in the world. They have to be. The moment you let emotion override calculation, you're dead or arrested. Tony's bosses didn't get where they are by making emotional decisions. They got there by making smart ones. At the bar, Rosie was already telling the story to a group of late arrivals, his hands gesturing animatedly, recreating the moment when Tony had used that word and the subsequent silence that followed. By closing time, the story would have a dozen variations. By morning, it would have 100. By next week, it would be legend. But the core truth would remain. A Colombo capo came to Harlem trying to take what wasn't his. He brought offers and threats, and ultimately disrespect. And he left having learned that some neighborhoods can't be bought, can't be intimidated, can't be absorbed into structures that don't recognize their humanity. In the days and weeks that followed August 4th, 1961, the Italian crime families maintained their operations throughout New York City. The unions, the docks, the construction sites, the waste management contracts. But Harlem remained Harlem, independent, sovereign, a black neighborhood that had looked organized crime in the face and said no with such finality that the question was never asked again. Tony Maronei reportedly told his bosses what happened, including the slur. According to street intelligence that filtered back through various channels, the Colombo leadership was furious, not at Bumpy's rejection, but at Tony's handling of the situation. You don't use that word in someone else's neighborhood and expect cooperation. You don't burn bridges you might need later. You don't create enemies for no strategic gain. Tony was demoted. Not immediately, that would have looked like weakness, but gradually, over months, his responsibilities were redistributed to others, his authority eroded, his future within the family diminished. In organized crime, as in any enterprise, you're only as valuable as your last deal. Tony's last deal had cost the Colombo family access to one of the most profitable territories in New York. But the real impact of that night wasn't about territory or money.
It was about identity, about a community that knew itself, protected itself, demanded respect for itself. Harlem in 1961 was a powder keg of racial tension, political awakening, cultural pride. The civil rights movement was building momentum. Malcolm X was speaking truth to power at Mosque Number 7 just blocks away. The words Black Power were beginning to resonate, not as a threat, but as a statement of self-determination. Bumpy Johnson understood that. He understood that his power didn't come from being the toughest or the most ruthless. It came from being the embodiment of Harlem's collective refusal to accept less than full humanity. When he sat across from Tony Maronei and heard that word, when he absorbed the insult without reacting violently, when he delivered those 6 words with absolute certainty, he wasn't speaking for himself alone. He was speaking for every black person who'd been diminished by that word, who'd been offered crumbs and expected to show gratitude, who'd been told that safety and respect and partnership were privileges to be granted by others rather than rights to be claimed for themselves. He was speaking for Harlem, and Harlem, through him, drew a line, not with violence, not with chaos, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty that comes from knowing your worth, knowing your power, knowing that sometimes the smartest move is making your enemy understand that victory would cost more than defeat. The 6 words Bumpy Johnson spoke that night, "You'll never be safe here again," became legendary not because they were a threat of violence, but because they were a statement of transformation. The old dynamic, where black neighborhoods were territories to be claimed and controlled by outside organizations, died in the Lennox Lounge on August 4, 1961. It died the moment Tony Maronei used that word. It died the moment he realized he'd miscalculated.
It died the moment he understood that disrespect, once given, cannot be taken back, and consequences, once set in motion, cannot be stopped. And it stayed dead. Because real power isn't measured in guns or money or territory. Real power is measured in what you build, what you protect, what you refuse to accept, and most importantly, what you make others understand without having to fire a single shot. Bumpy Johnson knew that, and on August 4, 1961, he made sure the Colombo family learned it too. The lesson echoed through the decades that followed. When other organizations, criminal or otherwise, looked at Harlem, they remembered the story. They remembered what happened when you came with disrespect disguised as opportunity. They remembered the man who sat in a curved booth with a glass of Hennessy and delivered 6 words that changed everything. They remembered that some neighborhoods aren't conquered, they're earned. And they remembered that Bumpy Johnson had earned Harlem long before anyone else even understood what that meant.